I understood they buried me alive, but I'm still breathing. And if they decided to erase my name, I'll make them rewrite it myself. I always loved the smell of wet wood. Even now, when my joints ache and my hands tremble, I still pick up a plane and run along the board, as if stroking the back of an old dog. It's a habit, work that always gave me back the feeling that I was needed. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The house stands on the edge of a rocky shore. The neighbors are used to seeing me on the porch, sometimes with a mug of coffee, sometimes with a tool in my hands. I fix boats, cabinets, swings, for myself and for others. That's how it's been for decades. But today on the porch there wasn't a board or a postcard. Today there was a newspaper. Usually I don't read the morning issues. The news always seemed foreign. Wars, politics, someone's victories and defeats. But this issue caught my eye. A thick headline: New project in Old Portland. Modern residential complex on the site of dilapidated buildings. I was about to flip past it, but my eyes stopped on the photograph. In the picture was my house, my porch, my windows, from which so many times the smell of Mary's pies had drifted. I froze. I read it again and again. Demolition permit granted. Documents signed by owner John Delaney. John, my son. The newspaper shook in my hands. Maybe from the wind, or maybe because my heart had leapt into my throat. I reread the line 3 times. They claimed that I myself had agreed, that I had signed the papers. But I hadn't signed anything. I remember that summer too well. I was lying in the hospital, my face twisted, learning to hold a spoon again. And during that time, it turns out, someone was signing for me. I sat down on the porch step. The board beneath me creaked. A familiar sound, like in the old shed where I used to fix neighbors' boats. A sound that reminded me of life. But now it rang out like a crack in my chest. John, I whispered. Why? Through the noise of the surf, I heard footsteps. Neighbor Molly was passing by. She waved her hand. Frank, good morning. You look a little pale. I mechanically lifted the newspaper. Wanted to show it, but the words stuck. What could I say? That my own son erased me from my own story? That I'm unnecessary even in my own house? I only nodded. Molly disappeared behind the fence, and I looked again at the photo. The house stood empty in the newspaper picture, as if already dead. I ran my finger along the outline of the roof. I had built it myself. Drove in every nail when John was still running barefoot on the grass. And now he had decided that these walls were trash, that his father was trash. I stood up. My hands trembled, but inside a fire was flaring up. If they decided to erase me, then I'd have to remind them that I'm still alive. I stepped into the house. On the table lay an old ink pen, the one I once used to sign my first orders for boat repairs. I picked it up. In this pen is my story, my name, and I won't allow it to be stolen. I sat at the table and spread out the newspaper. Ink lay down on the margins. This is a lie. I did not give consent. I lifted my head and saw a reflection in the window. An old man with gray hair, with wrinkles, with eyes that still held light. And suddenly I realized, today my life changed. Today I stopped being a shadow. And at that moment, there was a knock at the door. The knock on the door was sharp, as if someone wanted to drive a nail out of wood. I rose carefully. My joints cracked, but my chest was pounding as if I were 20 again. On the threshold stood a stranger in a dark coat. His face was dry, his eyes quick, like those of an accountant or a lawyer. In his hands was a folder. Mr. Delaney? He asked in an even voice. Depends on who's asking. I represent the development company North Shore. I came to confirm the date the house will be vacated. He said it as if it were about a trash can that needed to be put out by the curb. Vacated? I repeated, feeling the heat rise to my face. This is my house. The man opened a folder and took out a copy of a document. My last name and my signature stood out there. The handwriting looked similar, but I immediately knew it wasn't mine. The lines shook differently. The letters stretched out, as if written by someone who had never held this pen. Here's the power of attorney. Everything's legal, he said, handed me the sheet. I didn't take it. I just stared. He shrugged, as if in front of a stubborn child. Your son signed for you. Everything's in order. The house will be demolished in 2 months. I advise you to start moving out in advance. I wanted to reply, but the words stuck in my throat. Only the creaking of the floorboards under my feet reminded me that I still existed. The man snapped the folder shut and left. I closed the door and went down to the basement. My old tools were stored there. Hammers, wrenches, planes. Boards hung on the walls, each with its own story. It smelled of oil and salt here. Here I felt alive. I sat on a stool and remembered the time when John was still a boy. I taught him how to plane a board, showed him how to hold the tool properly. His palms were small but confident. Back then, he looked up at me with respect. Where is it now? In the corner stood an old safe. I hadn't opened it in a long time. Only Mary knew the code. But after her death, I had eventually decided to write the combination down on a scrap of paper. My hand reached for the lock. Click. The door gave way. Inside, envelopes, photographs, and a thick folder. On the cover, in Mary's crooked handwriting, it said, "Don't forget who you are." I pulled out one of the envelopes. Inside, her diary entries, words full of care and faith in me. I flipped through a few pages and came across a line. Frank never yells, but if he is forgotten, it will be a crime against kindness. I ran my fingers over the line. It burned me, as if Mary herself whispered to me, "Don't give up." At that moment, I realized I had to seek the truth. I had to prove the signature was fake. But how? And then I remembered I once had an accountant friend, Peter. He used to help with taxes, and he also knew about handwriting and signatures. If anyone could say the paper was fake, it was him. I climbed the creaky stairs. The newspaper lay on the table. Next to that very document the man in the coat had shoved at me. I slipped both sheets into a folder and put on my jacket. I had to go to Peter. Maybe he still remembered me. Maybe he was the only one who would believe. I walked out of the house. The sea air hit my face. The shore roared with waves. Seagulls screamed over the roof. I walked down the street, standing straight, as if I were once again the young craftsman who could build a boat from scratch. But inside, everything trembled, because if Peter said the signature was real, then I would have nothing left. I approached his house and raised my hand to knock, but the door opened on its own. Peter stood on the threshold. He looked at me as if he had been waiting for a long time, and he said one word, "Too late, too late," Peter repeated, but his eyes softened. "I was waiting for you, Frank. I thought you'd come sooner." We sat in the kitchen. The table was covered with old bills, mugs with unfinished coffee. Peter pulled out his glasses, laid out the documents I had brought in front of him, and began to read. "See this?" He pointed at the signature. "At first glance, it looks like yours. But here's the detail. Your letter D always goes slightly upward, but here, downward. And the lines shake, but differently. This was written by a healthy hand. And you were lying in the hospital after stroke at the time. So it's a forgery?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Undoubtedly. But the problem lies elsewhere." He raised his eyes. "It went through City Hall. It's all registered. In their eyes, the papers are genuine." I leaned back in the chair. The splash of waves outside the window seemed to grow louder. The paper lied, but the law stood on its side. What should I do? I exhaled. First, go to the municipality. But be ready. They won't listen to you there. It's easier for them to believe a stamp than a man. I thanked Peter and left. The frost grew sharper, but inside I felt a heat that wouldn't let me stop. The City Hall building greeted me with the smell of old paint and the indifference of officials. I filed a statement, attached a newspaper copy, and said, "This is a mistake. I didn't sign. It's a fake. The woman at the counter didn't even lift her head. The database shows you surrendered ownership. All documents are in order, but it's a forgery." I raised my voice. "I want to see the department head." Reluctantly, she called a man in a suit. He came out, extended his hand, but looked past me as if I were transparent. "What's the issue?" I repeated everything again. He listened, nodded slightly, then said, "Mr. Delaney, we cannot go against the documents. You signed them yourself. Everything is registered." I didn't sign. I struck the counter with my fist. I was in the hospital. Silence. People in line turned around. Someone smirked. Someone looked away. And the official said quietly, coldly, "Please calm down. You are disturbing the work." I realized that to them I was nobody, invisible, an old man who should keep silent. My chest tightened. I walked out of the building without feeling my legs. Outside, the snow fell in large flakes, and each one struck my face like a slap. I walked down the street thinking, so this is what it means to be forgotten. So this is what it means when your word is worth nothing. I reached the shore. The wind tore at my coat, and the waves crashed against the rocks. I stood and watched the foaming water, and suddenly I remembered once I taught John to fish. He was afraid of falling overboard, and I said, "Hold on to me, and you won't drown." Now he himself is pushing me overboard. I returned home late. In my pocket rustled that very newspaper. I threw it onto the table, and my eyes fell on the safe. Inside remained Mary's diary. I pulled it out, opened it at random, and saw, "If he is forgotten, it will be a crime against kindness." I closed my eyes. She believed I was stronger, and I had just proven the opposite. But at that moment the phone rang. Neighbor Molly. Her voice was agitated. "Frank, did you see the news online? Your son gave an interview." "An interview?" I barely managed to say. "Yes. He said you yourself asked him to sell the house because you don't want to be a burden." I froze. A fire flared in my chest. Not only the house. Now he was stealing my name. I dropped the phone and looked out the window. Snow was falling on the porch, and it seemed to me that it was burying my house, turning it into a nameless grave. And then I said aloud, "No, I won't let myself be buried." And at that moment, headlights flared on my porch. A car stopped right at the house. The headlights cut across the windows. I got up and opened the door. Outside stood my son's car, but he wasn't behind the wheel. It was a courier. A young man in a bright jacket handed me an envelope. "For you, Mr. Delaney." I signed with a trembling hand. The car drove away, leaving me alone on the dark street. The envelope was thick. I tore it open. Inside, an official notice. "We hereby notify you the necessity to vacate the house within 30 days. 30 days. A month. And that's all." I threw the papers on the table and went down to the basement. I needed a place where the walls remembered me. The basement was just that. Here every board knew my voice. Every paint stain carried the trace of my hand. I turned on the lamp. The light fell on Mary's old diary. I opened it again, this time slowly, carefully. On the pages, her life, her thoughts about me. Here was a note from 20 years ago. "Frank doesn't like to argue, but he knows how to listen. I know that his voice will always be the last, not because it's louder, but because it's the right one." I smiled through the bitterness. And further, "If he is forgotten, it will be a crime against kindness." I had already read these words, but today they sounded different. Not as comfort, but as a challenge, as an order. I ran my finger along the line, and I understood I was obliged to prove that I still existed, that my name could not be crossed out with a stamp. Suddenly the boards in the basement creaked. The wind shook the door, and an old box fell to the floor. I lifted the lid. Inside, photographs. Me, Mary, little John. He was standing on the shore, holding a toy boat in his hands. And I was next to him, fastening the sail. The photograph burned me. I remembered how I told my son, "If you ever lose your way, look at the sail. It will always show you the way." And now he himself had lost the way, or decided the road was without me. I went upstairs and looked again at the notice, 30 days. But I wasn't going to pack my things. I was going to fight. I sat at the table, took a pen and a blank sheet of paper. I wrote, "My name is Frank Delaney. I am 74. I built this house with my own hands. And now my son is trying to erase my life. But I do not agree. I am alive. I am here." I reread it and realized this was not a letter. This was a statement. No, more than that, this was a cry, and the cry had to be heard. I folded the sheet and put it into an envelope. I wrote the address automatically, the local newspaper's editorial office. If City Hall pretended I didn't exist, then let the whole town know. In the morning, I took the letter. The secretary accepted the envelope and nodded indifferently. I left, not knowing whether they would read it all. Returning home, I went back down to the basement. I sat on the stool and opened Mary's diary to the last page. There was a short note. If one day you are betrayed, don't shout. Build again, but so that everyone can see. I lifted my head. Build again. But how? And then the phone rang. I picked it up. The voice was young, excited. Mr. Delaney, this is from the newspaper. We want to print your letter. Tomorrow morning it will be on the front page. I didn't immediately know what to answer. Then I said, so they will hear me after all? Everyone will hear. I put down the phone and felt a chill run along my skin. For the first time in a long time, I was not invisible. But I knew tomorrow everything would change. I climbed the stairs, went out onto the porch, and breathed in the ocean air. The waves crashed against the rocks. And at that moment behind me on the road, headlights flared again. But this time the car didn't drive past. It stopped at my house. The car by the house turned out not be a threat, but a coincidence. A neighbor fisherman had brought Kratz's catch and by mistake stopped at my porch. But it seemed to me as if the night itself was testing me. Was I ready for the fact that tomorrow people would speak of me aloud? The morning greeted me with the smell of salt and wind. I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of black coffee and saw the newspaper in the box. My heart pounded like on the first day of fishing. I tore open the wrapping and unfolded the front page. There was my letter, in big letters. My name is Frank Delaney. I am still alive. I read my text, printed in black type. Every word sounded louder than I expected. My son sold my house without my consent. He wants to erase my life for the sake of a parking lot. But I am not dead. I am only old. And I do not agree. I held the newspaper in my hands, and my fingers trembled. Tears welled up, but I did not let them fall. This was not about tears. This was about a voice. Neighbor Molly came out of the house across the street and saw me. She also had the newspaper in her hands. Frank, she shouted, I knew you wouldn't give up. Soon other neighbors came over. Some shook my hand. Some patted my shoulder. One young man said, you said what we were all thinking, that we cannot be crossed out just because we don't fit into the plans. I felt, for the first time in a long time, that people looked at me not as a shadow, but as a person. During the day, the editor called me. Mr. Delaney, your letter exploded on social media. People are sharing it, commenting, debating. Even television got interested. Television? I repeated in disbelief. Yes, they want to interview you. Tomorrow morning. I sat down on a chair, holding the receiver. Once I had taught my son to tie his shoelaces, showed him how to hold a plane properly, and now I had to explain to the whole town why I could not be erased from my own life. In the evening, the phone rang again. This time the voice was familiar. John, Father, what have you done? He said coldly, why are you disgracing me? Disgracing? I stood up, gripping the receiver until my knuckles turned white. You stole my house. You told everyone I asked you myself. You turned me into a ghost. And now you call this disgrace? You don't understand, he said sharply. This project is important. People are waiting. Money is invested. You're interfering. And you don't understand, I cut him off, that this is not about a project. It's about me, about my life. A pause hung. Then John hissed, tomorrow will all end. He hung up. I sat in the dark for a long time. His voice still rang in my ears. Tomorrow will all end. What did he mean? The next morning a film crew came to me. A camera, a microphone, bright lights, all of it seemed foreign. But when the journalist asked, what do you want to say to your son and to everyone who thinks that old people can be erased? I looked straight into the camera and said, my son wants to erase my life because it doesn't bring profit. But I taught him to tie shoelaces. I taught him to hold a sail, when he was afraid of falling overboard. That is more important than dollars. That is the foundation. The cameraman lowered the camera, and the journalist was silent for a second before asking the next question. I felt that my words were flying farther than ever before. And at that very moment, when I had for the first time gained the strength of voice, a man in a strict suit entered the house. He waited for a pause and said, "Mr. Delaney, you must stop. Otherwise you will lose everything." The man in the suit stood at the door as if he were the owner. His face was stone, his voice cold. "Your words have already caused a stir. I advise you to stop. Otherwise, you will lose not only the house, but also respect." I looked straight at him. "Respect?" I said quietly. I didn't lose it now. My son stole it. He winced, as if I had said something improper, and left without closing the door behind him. I sat in the chair for a long time. In my head the words rang, "Lose respect." But did they ever have it? Respect was from the neighbors, from those whose boats and swings I fixed. My son no longer had it. The next morning I saw a strange sight. 3 tents stood on my lot. Near them were Molly, my fisherman neighbor Ben, and a couple of guys from the next block. In their hands were cardboard signs. This house was built by hands, not by blueprints. "What is this?" I asked in astonishment. Molly smiled. "We read your letter. We saw the interview. We won't let them tear your house down." I looked at them and couldn't believe it. People held signs as if this were the city center, not a quiet shore. Ben said, "You've helped us your whole life. Now it's your turn to get help." My heart tightened. I wanted to say something, but no words came. I just nodded and felt my throat choke up. By noon, there were more tents. Neighborhood teenagers painted a huge banner, "Don't erase Frank." People brought food, thermoses of tea. It seemed as if the whole neighborhood had gathered at my house. In the evening, the police arrived. 2 officers came up and asked everyone to disperse. But the crowd didn't move. Molly lifted her sign and said, "If you want to remove Frank, remove us too." The policemen exchanged glances, sighed, and drove off. I stood on the porch, watching it all. I felt something new flare up inside me. Not revenge, not anger, strength. I was needed again. The phone rang. "John again. You've turned your house into a circus," he said irritably. "People are laughing at me." I answered calmly, "This isn't a circus. This is the truth. And you're afraid of the truth. You think you've won?" His voice broke. "I'll destroy all of this." He hung up. I looked at the phone and realized there it was, the first crack in his confidence. For the first time, he sounded not like a victor, but like a man threatened by his own lie. I went out onto the porch. The neighbors sat by a fire, laughing, singing old songs. The air was filled with smoke and freedom. I sat down on the rocker, and for the first time in a long time my chest was warm. But that same night, close at midnight, there was a loud sound, a blow against a gate. The neighbors jumped up. Someone shouted. On the road stood a car, and in the headlights, several men in dark jackets. They were walking straight toward my house. They walked in a line, ankle deep in snow. 3 figures in dark jackets. Behind them a pickup with a trailer and the North Shore logo. The neighbors rose from the fire, put out the guitar, but not the signs. I went down the steps, holding on to the railing. In my pocket, an old adjustable wrench. Not a weapon. A reminder that any nut can be turned the right way. "Private property," I said calmly. "Leave." The leader smirked. "You have 30 days. But a tent camp is a violation. We warned you. Step aside." "We're not going anywhere," said Molly, lifting her sign. "This is a home. Let's not improvise." The leader turned to me. "Call your son. Let him explain the rules to them." I turned on the speakerphone. Rings once, twice. John picked up on the third. "What now, Father?" "There are people here from your partners," I said, so that everyone could hear. "They're asking to remove those who are protecting me. Is that your order?" Pause. "Remove the tents," said John. "They're interfering with business." "What business?" I'd asked. "My funeral?" Phones were lifted higher. It was a live broadcast. The leader waved his hand. 2 moved toward the gates. I raise my palm. One more step, and you'll touch people who are standing on their own land. Does your company want to start with a scandal? Film it, Ben whispered. We're filming everything. I remembered Mary's phrase, if you are betrayed, don't shout. Build again, but so that everyone can see. You can also rebuild a boundary. I took chalk from a box and drew a line across the snow, from the gate to the porch, like a chalk line on a deck. Beyond this line is my home. Every nail in it is my name. Step over, and you'll be saying your right is higher than human. Psychology won't work on us. Old man. One barked and lifted his foot above the line. I didn't raise my voice. John, tell them not to cross. Why, you still can save face. He snorted. Face? Old man, get out of the way. I said break the camp. The phrase fell on microphones heavily and irreversibly. Notifications poured in. In the chat, words ran. The son orders to break it. So this is what he's like. You heard it, I said. That's your boss. The leader lost confidence for a second, and then by the road a siren wailed. A patrol car rolled slowly up to the gate. The officer got out. What's going on here? He ordered to break it. Molly nodded at my phone. It was live. The officer looked at me. You the owner? I'm the one they're trying to erase. I answered, but the house still stands. He turned his gaze to the men in jackets. Any action? Only by court order. Until then, step back and shut off the trailer. The pickup went silent. In the crowd, someone clapped. The leader looked at me with hatred, but retreated to the car. His confidence, like a cheap anchor, pulled out of nothingness and couldn't hold the beam. The first public crack ran across my son's facade, and the whole neighborhood heard it. When they left, the snow was quiet again. I sat on the top step, laid the adjustable wrench beside me, and realized, today we cast in chalk a new foundation, thin but real. I looked at the phone, dozens of messages, among them one from an unknown number. Mr. Delaney, I saw the broadcast. This is Matt Harper. Once I learned from you how to fix frames. Now I'm a lawyer. Let me help. I began to type a reply and froze, because at the gate stood a man in a dark coat. He lifted his head and said, Teacher? Teacher? I repeated, looking at the man at the gate. He was a head taller than me, in an expensive coat, with a briefcase in his hand. But in his eyes, I saw the boy who once came into my workshop with a broken oar. Matt Harper, he introduced himself. You taught me to repair boats. I was a teenager then. You told me. Any cracked frame can be saved if you know where to place the support. I remembered that forever. I smiled faintly. I see you put a support under your own life. Yes, I became a lawyer. And, honestly, much in the profession reminds me of your lesson. He stepped through the gate and extended his hand. I will help you. The papers your son signed are a dirty forgery. We can challenge them. But there's little time. We sat in the kitchen. Outside, the laughter of neighbors by the tents could be heard. Matt spread on the table the documents he had photographed on his phone. I already saw the broadcast. You have strength. People are on your side. But that's not enough. You need legal weapons. And if it doesn't work? I asked, then the house will be demolished. But even then we will make it, so that your son loses all respect. I was silent for a long time. My wife's words from the diary spun in my head. If he is forgotten, it will be a crime against kindness. No, there will be no forgetting. What's needed? I asked, first, prove the signature isn't yours. Second, file a lawsuit. Third, don't let them break public opinion. I nodded. With the signature, Peter, my old accountant, can help. He noticed the inconsistencies. Excellent. We'll contact him. Matt pulled out a business card. And one more thing. Tomorrow's city commission meeting is scheduled. Your son will be there. They want to present the project to the public. That's a chance. A chance for what? For your son's first public defeat. I froze. Something stirred inside me. I remembered John as a little boy standing beside me. Looking up, now he looked down, forgetting who I was. But tomorrow I could return that gaze. We agreed to meet in the morning at the commission building. Matt left, leaving the case folder. I picked it up and felt its weight. It wasn't just cardboard. It was a tool, a new wrench with which I could turn fate. I stepped out onto the porch. The neighbors hadn't left yet. Molly came up and asked, "Who was that?" "A student," I replied. "One of those who remembers." She nodded. "Then you'll have an army, Frank." The night smelled of campfire smoke and ocean salt. I lay down in bed, but sleep didn't come. Tomorrow I had to face John not as a father, but as an opponent. And by dawn I had a dream, as if I were playing a board again, and behind me Mary stood and said, "Build so that everyone can see." I woke up and realized the day had come. At the door, people with signs were already waiting, and a bus that would take us all to City Hall. The City Hall building buzzed like a hive. Inside it smelled of cheap coffee and paper, but the air was taut like a sail before a storm. At the entrance they checked documents, but they let me through without questions. The journalists already knew my face. The neighbors held signs and whispered, "Frank, hold on." The commission hall was crowded. On the stage, a long table with officials seated behind it. In the center, John, in a suit with an expensive watch, surrounded by partners. His smile was as flawless as his tie. But when he saw me in the crowd, his smile faltered. "Gentlemen," he began confidently, "the residential complex project will provide new jobs and a modern look for the city. The old will go so that the new may come." A slide on the screen. Shiny buildings in place of my house. Applause from a few supporters. I felt my fists clench. "But the old is not trash," I said, standing up. My voice rang out loudly, even without a microphone. "The old is a foundation. Everything new rests on it." The hall began to whisper. An official tried to stop me, but Matt raised his hand. "Mr. Chairman, we have a statement of violation. The sale of Delaney's house was carried out with forged documents." A murmur rose in the hall. Cameras clicked. John turned pale. "That's a lie," he shouted. "My father signed everything himself. He just doesn't remember." "Don't remember?" I stepped forward. "I remember every board in that house, every nail, and I did not sign that document." Matt pulled out papers. "Here is the expert's conclusion. The signature was falsified." The noise grew louder. The officials whispered among themselves. One of them looked sternly at John. "You claimed everything was clean." John threw up his hands. "You don't understand. He's old. He's confused." And at that moment, Molly stepped out from the crowd. In her hands was a sign, but she raised a newspaper, the fresh issue. "Old?" And he wrote a letter that the whole city read. And not a single letter there is confused. The hall erupted in applause. John tried to say something, but his words drowned in the noise. For the first time I saw him lose ground. His confidence cracked in front of everyone. I raised my hand. Silence returned. "I don't want money. I don't want war. I only want that my name not be thrown in the trash. I am alive. I am here." The officials at the table exchanged glances. The chairman cleared his throat and said, "The meeting is postponed. We need to review the documents. Until a court decision, no actions on the house will be taken." The crowd applauded again. I sat down, feeling my heart pound. It was the first victory. But John leaned toward the microphone and said quietly, almost in a whisper, "If you think this is the end, you don't know what I'm ready for." And he looked straight at me, not as a son at a father, as an enemy at an enemy. After the city hall meeting, I went outside and breathed in the icy air. People applauded. Neighbors shook my hand. But inside, I didn't feel victory. John's words rang in my head, as if a rusty nail was being driven deeper. "You don't know what I'm ready for." Matt walked beside me, talking about courts, documents, about how now we had a chance. But all I heard was the ringing in my ears. I saw my son before my eyes, not the boy with a toy boat, but the man in a suit for whom strangers' applause mattered more than his father's gaze. In the evening, I sat on the porch. The ocean wind carried the smell of salt and seaweed. Snow settled on the railings. The neighbors had gone home. The tents remained in the yard, like little fortresses of loyalty. I opened Mary's diary. At random, I came upon an entry. "The most frightening thing is not loneliness. The The most frightening thing is betrayal by someone close. My chest ached, and at that moment the phone rang. "Mr. Delaney? This is the police." "We have news," said a dry voice. "What kind?" "Today your son filed a counterclaim. He claims that you are legally incapacitated." I froze. "What did you say?" "A doctor's certificate has been submitted to court. Allegedly after your stroke, you don't understand your actions. He is asking for a guardian to be appointed." The word guardian struck like a hammer. It meant I wasn't just losing the house. I was losing myself. "That's a lie," I exhaled. "The court will decide." The voice cut me off and disconnected. I sat motionless, snow falling on my shoulders. The world became empty, like a deck after a storm, when the sea had taken everything. The gear, the sails, the faith. And then John appeared on the porch. He stepped out of the darkness quietly, like a stranger. "Father," he said evenly, "it's over. You'll be declared incapacitated. The house is ours." I lifted my eyes. "Why? This house held you too." "No," he answered coldly. "This isn't a house. It's an asset, and I'll turn it into money." He spoke without emotion, like a banker at a deal. No son remained, no memories, only an investor. He turned and walked away into the night. I stayed sitting. Inside I felt no anger, only ashes. Mary's words in the diary sounded like mockery. "He is stronger than all." But I felt broken, and suddenly the phone screen lit up. A message from Matt. "Don't give up." I found the key. Tomorrow everything will change. The night passed painfully. I lay on the bed, listening to the old house creak in the wind, as if it were breathing in rhythm with my anxious heart. Every gust of the ocean threw drops of salt against the windows, and it seemed the waves were trying to break in, to wash away the last remnants of my will. I tossed and turned, catching every echo of footsteps behind the door, and my thoughts returned to my son's words. Guardian. A word that chilled deeper than any winter wind. It meant they wanted to strip me of the right to be myself. Dawn was gray, the sky heavy. I had barely pulled on a sweater when there was a knock. On the porch stood Matt, tall, confident, with a folder under his arm, and with that look I recognized instantly, the look of a man who had found a solution. "I promise a key," he said, stepping inside, and his voice carried resolve. "And I found it." We sat down in the kitchen. The room smelled of coffee, wood, and the old oil I once rubbed into my tools. Outside, the neighbors' tents glistened with frost. Smoke rose above the campfires. I heard the voices of the people who had spent the night on my property and thought, they believe in me more than I believe in myself. Matt spread out the papers, his fingers running across the lines. "John plays dirty. But that's exactly what will ruin him." The certificate he submitted was signed by a doctor with a bad reputation. That man had his license revoked long ago. I found proof. In court, this document will collapse. I looked at him, afraid to believe. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. And one more thing. We found a video recording of the commission meeting. You can hear your son saying, 'The old man is confused, and we need to break the camp.' That is direct evidence of contempt." Those words burned worse than frost. But in my chest a spark began to form. Not revenge, but hope. "But the main thing is ahead," Matt continued. "In a week is the hearing. There you must speak, not as a complaining old man, but as the master of your life. People must see the Frank who built boats and houses, who didn't give up even in a storm." I nodded silently, and at that moment a car pulled up to the house. Journalists stepped out, their cameras flashing like knives in the sun. Questions poured in one after another. "What do you say about your son's claim? Is it true you are incapacitated? Why do you need this fight?" I raised my hand. The crowd fell silent. "My son claims I am incapable of thought. But I remember every board I nailed into this house. I remember my wife's hands, the smell of bread, the laughter of children on the swings I built. If all that is madness, then I am ready to be a madman." Silence hung in the air. Then one clap, another, a third. People applauded. The cameras blinked, catching every word. I felt that my life was no longer just a line in someone else's case. It had once again become a story heard by all. The journalist asked about the key, and Matt answered firmly, "In court, we will prove the truth is on our side." When everyone left, we were back in the kitchen. Matt spoke quietly, almost in a whisper. "Today you took a step, but tomorrow your son will go all the way. He won't forgive losing control." I was silent, but in my head Mary's diary line resounded. If he has forgotten, it will be a crime against kindness. Late in the evening, the neighbors gathered again at the fire. I went out to them. Dozens of eyes, full of expectation, glowed in the flame. "Thank you for being here," I said. "Tomorrow will be harder, but if we endure, it will become our shared memory." The people applauded. But beyond the fence, I noticed a shadow. John. He stood motionless, staring at me. His face was stone. And I understood he would not stop. The week dragged on painfully. The house was silent, as if the very walls were waiting for the outcome. The neighbors kept watch by the tents, brought food, sometimes laughed by the fire, but inside me grew the feeling that all of it could disappear in an instant. On the day of the hearing, we entered the courtroom. The ceilings were high, the walls cold, and the air thick with tension. I walked slowly, but my back was straight. In people's eyes there was interest, not pity. They wanted to see how an old man would challenge his own son. The judge took his seat, and the proceedings began. John's lawyer spoke first. Young, clean-shaven, with a voice polished as if for advertising. He spoke of care for an elderly father, of recommendations from doctors, of how I confuse my memories. I listened, and a wave of anger rose in my chest. But Matt sat beside me, holding the folder firmly. Steady, he whispered, "Your time will come." Finally my turn came. I stood up. The judge asked, "Mr. Delaney, do you acknowledge that you are in need of guardianship?" I straightened. "I acknowledge that I am 74. I acknowledge that I had a stroke. But I also acknowledge this. I built the house in which my son grew up. I repaired boats for the whole neighborhood. And if that means I am incapable of thought, then we are all blind here." A murmur spread through the hall. I saw journalists writing down every word. But then John's lawyer struck his first trump card. "We have a medical report." He spread out the papers. "The doctor states, after the stroke, Delaney's cognitive functions are impaired." The judge frowned. All eyes turned to me. At that moment, I felt the ground slip out from under me. Matt jumped up. "Objection," he said. "This doctor was stripped of his license for falsifying reports. We have the documents." The judge took the papers, studied them for a long time, but time dragged painfully. People in the hall exchanged glances, and at some point it seemed to me that everything was over. I sat back down. My chest was empty, like a boat with a hole in its bottom. I remembered Mary, her smile, her words that if I were forgotten it would be a crime. And suddenly I feared she had been wrong, that I was already being forgotten. Silence fell in the hall. The judge lifted his head. The evidence will be examined. The decision will be rendered later. It was not a victory, but not a defeat either. Just waiting. When we went outside, a crowd of journalists surrounded us. Cameras glared into my eyes. Questions poured in. "Are you losing? What's next? Do you feel support?" I wanted to answer, but my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I stood silent, and only one thought burned inside. What if I really have lost? And just then John came out behind me. He stopped in front of the cameras, looked straight into the lens, and said, "My father no longer understands what he's doing. He must be stopped, for his own good." A gasp went through the crowd. The words fell like a heavy stone, and I stood in the center, feeling the world ready to collapse. After the trial, I returned home broken. The neighbors greeted me with applause, but I couldn't raise my eyes. Their support was sincere, but in my heart burned the feeling that John had dropped me in front of everyone. His words echoed inside me like a sentence. He doesn't understand what he's doing. I sat by the fireplace, leafing through Mary's diary, as if in her lines I could find support. Frank never yells, but his silence is louder than any words. I closed my eyes. Maybe it really was time to be silent. Maybe it was time to admit defeat. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. On the porch stood Matt, covered in snow, his eyes shining. In his hands, a flash drive. "We found what we need," he said. We went into the kitchen. Matt plugged in a laptop and played a video. On the screen, a recording of John's conversation with his partners. A hidden camera, the sound not perfect, but the words clear. "Don't worry, I arranged everything. The old man doesn't count. He'll be declared incapacitated, and the house is ours. The main thing is to hold time until the court's decision." I froze. John's voice, my voice, only cold, alien. Every word struck harder than a blow. "Where did you get this?" I asked. One of the construction workers was unhappy with his pay. He made the recording and gave it to us. At first I didn't believe it, but now... Matt smiled. "This is the end of this game." I stared at the screen. My son spoke about me like I was garbage. But inside I felt not anger. Pain, yes, but also relief. Now the truth was on my side. "This will be a bomb," Matt said. "We'll present the recording in court. But better, show it to the people. Publicly. Let them see who he really is." The next day we gathered in the square. Journalists were already there, neighbors, even strangers from other districts. The crowd buzzed. Molly held a sign, "Don't erase Frank." Matt led me to the microphone. "Today you will hear what was meant to remain hidden," he said into the cameras. The voice of the one who tried to erase the memory of his own father. He turned on the recording. John's voice spread across the square. "The old man doesn't count. He'll be declared incapacitated, and the house is ours." The crowd roared. Someone shouted, "Shame!" Others whistled. Faces changed before my eyes, from curiosity to rage. I stood nearby, and it seemed to me that every one of his phrases drove into the ground like a nail in the coffin lid of his reputation. This was John's first true public humiliation. He appeared at the edge of the square, surrounded by his partners, but even they looked bewildered. John tried to shout something, to justify himself, but his cries drowned in the noise of the crowd. Cameras caught his every gesture, every drop of sweat. I raised my hand. The crowd fell silent. "This is my son," I said quietly but firmly. I once taught him to hold a sail. I said, "If you lose your way, look to the wind." But he chose another path. And now the wind speaks for itself. Applause struck like a wave. John stood with clenched fists, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. After the square, it seemed to me that we had won. The crowd dispersed, but people still came up, shook my hand, thanked me. I saw in their eyes not pity, but respect. And yet inside there was no joy. I knew John would not stop. The next morning there was another knock at the door. On the porch, a courier with an envelope. Inside was a summons, an urgent court session scheduled for tomorrow. The reason, a new claim from John's side. "What now?" I asked Matt, showing him the papers. He frowned. "They found a way to turn the situation around. If they have new evidence, it means they're preparing a dirty blow." The night passed without sleep. I walked through the house, touching the walls I might lose. Every nail, every board echoed my life. I opened Mary's diary, read her lines again and again. "If you're betrayed, build again, but so that everyone can see." But how can you build when everything is collapsing? The next day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, neighbors, even strangers. Everyone awaited the continuation. John sat confidently, as if yesterday's disgrace had never happened. His lawyer stood and presented the new materials. "Your Honor," he said, "we have a conclusion of another doctor, independent. He confirms that Mr. Delaney has persistent memory and reasoning impairments." The judge frowned. The documents were passed to the bench. I felt the cold climbing up my spine. Matt rose, objecting, but John's lawyer interrupted. "And we have a witness." A man in a white coat entered the hall. I didn't recognize him, but John smiled. "This specialist observed Mr. Delaney and is ready to confirm that he is incapable of being responsible for his actions." People in the hall buzzed. I jumped up. "Lies! No one observed me." The judge raised his hand. Silence. Witness testimony. The doctor spoke confidently, each of his words striking me. Memory loss, emotional instability, danger to himself. I wanted to shout, but the words drowned. The crowd whispered, and I saw some journalists already writing headlines. Old man loses his mind. Matt fought, asked questions, pointed out inconsistencies. But the judge looked pensive, as if leaning toward their version. I sat on the bench, and for the first time it seemed to me, everything was collapsing. The recording, the support, the crowd. All of it could turn into nothing against a single stamp and false words. I looked at my hands. Dry, wrinkled, but strong. With these hands I had built, repaired, saved, and now they trembled. Maybe Mary was wrong. Maybe I really had become weak. Flashed in my mind. I felt the walls of the hall pressing, as if ready to close in. The crowd faded from view, and I was left alone. And then John stood up. He walked to the microphone and said quietly, but so that everyone heard, I love my father, but he no longer understands what he's doing. For his own good, this house must be saved from him. The hall gasped. His words sounded like care, but I saw in people's eyes they were wavering. I lowered my head. This was the moment when I truly felt I was losing everything. I sat on the bench, my head lowered. It seemed that John's words, spoken with false tenderness, had finally brought the walls crashing down. The crowd wavered. The judge frowned. John's lawyer squared his shoulders in triumph. This was my moment of collapse. And suddenly I heard Mary's voice inside me, clear, as if she were standing right there. If he has forgotten, it will be a crime against kindness. Those words seemed to lift me from within. I stood. Your Honor, I said, and my voice trembled, but it was heard by everyone. I asked to speak. The judge nodded. I stepped forward. I looked not at the papers, not at the lawyers, but at the people in the hall. My son says he loves me, but love does not steal. Love does not turn a father into trash. Love does not build a parking lot on memory. Someone in the crowd shouted, "That's right." I drew a deeper breath. Yes, I am 74. Yes, I had a stroke, but I still remember. I remember holding his little hand when he was afraid of falling overboard. I remember when he caught his first fish and his eyes lit up. I remember building that house, driving in every nail. If remembering this is disease, then let me be declared the sickest man in the world. The judge listened attentively. People applauded. John turned pale, and then Matt raised a flash drive. Your Honor, we present a new recording. The voice of Mr. John Delaney himself. The screen lit up. John's voice rang out over the hall. The old man doesn't count. He'll be declared incapacitated, and the house is ours. The crowd exploded. Some whistled, some shouted, "Shame!" John tried to defend himself, but the noise drowned him. The judge struck the gavel, but silence returned only after I raised my hand. You heard it, I said. That is his love. That is his truth. I walked up to the table where the documents lay and placed Mary's diary on them. In this house, her words are still alive. She wrote, Frank never yells, but if he has forgotten, it will be a crime. Today I speak loudly. I will not allow myself to be erased. The judge looked at me for a long time. Then he turned his gaze to John. The court accepts the recording as evidence. The case to declare Mr. Delaney incapacitated is closed. The hall erupted in applause. I stood, gripping the edge of the table, and for the first time felt I was breathing freely. But it was not over yet. The judge added, on the case of the illegal sale of the house, proceedings will continue. The decision will be announced tomorrow. I returned to my seat. Neighbors patted me on the shoulder. Cameras flashed. But I looked only at John. His face was gray, his lips tight. He understood. Control was slipping away. And at that moment, I felt that the final battle would come tomorrow. The morning of the trial was clear and cold. I stepped out onto the porch and breathed in the ocean air. The waves crashed against the rocks, and their roar sounded like a herald of the finale. In the yard stood the neighbors. Some held signs. Some brought coffee. Some simply shook my hand in silence. Their presence was stronger than any words. In the courtroom, there was silence. Today, they were to decide the fate of the house. John sat across from me, his face tense, but his eyes darted. He no longer looked like a confident investor, rather like a cornered man who realized the walls were collapsing. The judge read the documents. The recording we had presented was recognized as key evidence. The forged power of attorney was officially annulled. The sale contract invalid. The house was returned to the owner. I closed my eyes. The words fell into my heart like a heavy stone, but it was a cornerstone. I felt the ground under my feet again. Applause broke out in the hall. Someone jumped up, someone shouted, "Frank, hold on." Journalists crowded, cameras flashed. But I did not smile. I looked at John. "Why?" I asked him quietly. "Why did you want to erase me?" He did not answer. He only lowered his head. His partners turned away, and for the first time he was left alone. This was his public ruin. 3 times he had tried to humiliate me, with the newspaper, with false doctors, with guardianship. But now the whole city saw he had lost his face. After the hearing, we went outside. The crowd greeted me. But I walked slowly, as if every movement were the last nail I drove into the new foundation. The house greeted me quietly. I walked through the rooms, the walls, the boards, the creak of the floorboards. All of it was not just things, but proof that I had lived. On the facade, the neighbors had nailed a new sign, House of Frank Delaney, a man who was not forgotten. I sat down in the rocking chair on the porch. The ocean splashed in front of me. Seagulls cried in the sky. I held Mary's diary in my hands. The last entry there read, "If one day he is left alone, he will find strength in what he built himself." I smiled. Inside there was not exultation, but silence. I knew vengeance ended not with a shout, but with the fact that I had become myself again. I existed. I looked at the ruins of yesterday's fears and understood. From ashes a bridge can be built. And this bridge connected me with those who now saw in me not a ghost, but a living man. I exist again, I said aloud, and no one can take that away. The wind carried my voice to the ocean, and the waves responded, as if putting the period to this story. If you like this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the right.